The shell casing was wrong. That was the first thing fleet analyst Sorenveth noticed when she reviewed the salvage logs from the debris field at Kepler's Reach. Not the scale of the destruction. Not the hull fragments of 17 Dominion warships spread across 400,000 kilometers of dead space. Not even the silence where a full assault wing had been, 12 hours before. The shell casing. It was sitting in the manifest, recovered from the interior of a destroyed human vessel, catalogued as inert, flagged as unknown propellant type, and it was too small. Laughably, impossibly small. The kind of small that made experienced ordnance analysts assume a filing error. Sorenveth did not assume a filing error. She pulled the full debris report. She cross-referenced the impact vectors. She sat back in her analyst chair aboard the asterisk contemplation of necessary outcomes and felt something she had not felt since her 3rd year of military service, when she had misidentified a distress signal as a decoy and sent 12 ships into an ambush. She felt like she had been looking at the wrong thing for a very long time. 3 months earlier, the Dominion Council had presented the prohibition in the way powerful institutions always present the things they are afraid of as a gift. The electromagnetic ordnance accords, High Executor Marinsal had announced before a full session of the Galactic Compact, his secondary arms folded in the posture of measured generosity, represent a necessary stabilization of the current conflict theater. All rail acceleration projectile systems above Class 7 energy output will be banned from use within contested star systems. This protects civilian infrastructure. It protects navigational lanes. It protects the integrity of shared stellar resources. He did not mention that it also neutralized humanity's primary weapons platform. He did not need to. Every species in that chamber understood what the accords actually were. The Vethkai delegation understood. The Solomari trade bloc understood. Even the notoriously conflict-averse Pelari, who voted in favor purely to avoid being noticed, understood. The accords were a leash dressed as a treaty, custom-fitted for a species that had arrived at interstellar war the way humans arrived at most things, 30 years late, under-equipped, and somehow already winning enough engagements to become a threat. Humanity's railguns were not the fastest weapons in the compact. They were not the most accurate, but they were human railguns, which meant they had been modified, adapted, repaired with non-standard components, fired at angles the targeting mathematics said were impossible, and operated by crews who had developed a disturbing cultural habit of nomming their guns and talking to them before engagements. The Dominion had done the threat assessment 3 times, because the first 2 results had seemed like errors. Humans were outgunned in every measurable category. They should have been losing every engagement they weren't losing. The railguns were the closest thing to an explanation, and so the Dominion had done what dominant powers do when they cannot defeat a weapons system on the battlefield. They banned it. The human delegation had sat quietly through the entire session. Their lead diplomat, a woman named Cassidy Akafer, had listened to the full presentation without speaking. She was younger than most of the other delegates, younger looking anyway, which Sorenveth had noted at the time without knowing why it bothered her. When the vote concluded and the accords passed with 41 signatures, Akafer had looked down at her hands for a long moment. Then she had smiled, just slightly, just at the corners. Sorenveth had been watching the feed in her analyst capacity, and she had flagged that expression in her report. She'd labeled it. Subject displays possible distress masked as acceptance. She had been wrong, she knew that now. She just didn't yet know what she'd been wrong about. The first month after the accords, human fleet activity dropped sharply. Not their aggression, their asterisk activity asterisk. Patrols that had previously covered 12 sectors contracted to 8. Resupply routes that had been aggressive and forward deployed pulled back toward their established colony lines. Dominion intelligence interpreted this as capitulation momentum. the predictable behavioral signature of a species that had lost its primary weapon system and was recalibrating to a fundamentally weaker posture. Fleet Admiral Darringcass ordered a measured advance. 3 systems, calculated to be uncomfortable without being provocative enough to shatter the accords politically. He wanted to establish a new territorial baseline before the humans finished whatever restructuring they were doing. He took Kepler's Reach without resistance. The human garrison had evacuated 16 hours before his fleet arrived. They had left the station intact, the infrastructure intact, the navigational beacons active. They had left it perfectly intact, which Darringcass found satisfying until his logistics commander pointed out that the humans had also removed every piece of equipment that was not bolted to a wall, and several things that had been. "What did they take?" he had asked. "Manufacturing components, sir. Fabrication systems, materials processors, everything portable and capable of producing a pause, we're not certain what." "Best estimate." "The fabrication profile is consistent with projectile ordnance systems, sir, but the material mass doesn't match any known munitions platform. They took enough raw stock to produce approximately 4 million units of something we have no template for." Darringcass had recorded that conversation. It appeared in Sorenveth's files. It appeared in her files because 3 months later, she was trying to understand what had happened to Darringcass's fleet, and she needed to understand when the humans had started. 4 million units. She kept coming back to that number. Lieutenant Commander Yusuf Adami had not been consulted about the accords. He was not the kind of person who got consulted about treaties. He was the kind of person who, 6 weeks after a treaty passed, was standing in a repurposed cargo bay on the * Resolute Persistence with 47 engineers, a materials physicist named Dr. Irina Vasquez, and a problem so enormous it had briefly caused him to lose the ability to speak. "Say it again," he had told Vasquez when she first laid out the constraints. "We can't use railguns. Class 7 electromagnetic threshold. Everything above that is prohibited. And our current platform runs at Class 11 baseline, Class 14 on the modified arrays." Yusuf had looked at the ceiling for a moment, and below Class 7. "Below Class 7, you have roughly the stopping power of a thrown rock. At the velocities we can achieve without the electromagnetic acceleration, you're talking about impacts that the Dominion standard hull plating will deflect at equivalent ranges. So we need a different delivery mechanism. We need a completely different physics of harm," Vasquez had said, and she hadn't sounded alarmed. She had sounded interested. "The accords restrict electromagnetic acceleration above Class 7. They say nothing about chemical propellant, nothing about pressure differentials, nothing about," she had paused, picking up a small component from the workbench, rolling it between her fingers, "shaped discontinuities in gas expansion." Yusuf had stared at her. "You're describing a gun." "I'm describing a concept that predates railguns by 400 years, and the Dominion has never encountered it. Because it's objectively inferior." "It was objectively inferior," Vasquez said. "Before I had access to metamaterial casings, programmable propellant sequencing, and approximately 6 weeks of nothing else to think about." She had smiled at him. She had the same smile as the diplomat. He hadn't noticed that at the time. He noticed it later. The Dominion's advance reached its second system target, the Ferris Junction Relay, in the 3rd week of the 2nd month. No resistance. The human vessels that had been patrolling there had withdrawn before the fleet arrived. They found the station occupied by a skeleton crew of 17 humans who surrendered immediately and completely, turning over access codes, station layouts, even personal communication devices. The station commander, a man with a beard so large that the Dominion processing officer had filed a separate note about it, shook the officer's secondary hand with both of his, made a remark that the translator rendered as *. "Hope you enjoy the place," "Watch out for the third corridor, the gravity's funny," and then sat quietly in detention, eating something he'd brought with him in a small, sealed container. The third corridor's gravity was, in fact, slightly miscalibrated. One Dominion soldier suffered a minor fall injury. The report listed the corridor under infrastructure deficiency requiring repair and noted no further anomalies. What the report did not note, because nobody thought to cross-reference the cargo manifests with the structural maintenance logs until Sorenveth did so, months later, was that the skeleton crew had spent their final 72 hours aboard not maintaining the station, but making 840 individual structural modifications to non-load-bearing internal components throughout the facility. None of those modifications made any obvious sense. Every single one of them was real. "They're retreating." Fleet Admiral Darringcass's voice carried a specific quality in the third-week debrief, a satisfaction that Sorenveth, reviewing the recording, had learned to distrust. It was the satisfaction of a pattern confirming itself. The removal of the railgun platform has degraded their operational confidence significantly. They're conceding territory rather than engaging. "Their fleet is regrouping at the Meridian Line," his intelligence chief had noted. "We believe they're consolidating for a defensive posture. Then we give them time to settle into it. Fixed positions favor us." Nobody had asked why the humans were leaving perfectly intact stations behind instead of destroying them. Nobody had asked why a species demonstrating asterisk retreat behavior was simultaneously running fabrication systems at maximum output in every rear area facility they hadn't vacated. Nobody had asked about the 4 million units. Sorenveth had been a junior analyst at that briefing. She had raised her hand and been gently, professionally ignored. She had written a 12-page report anyway. Her supervisor had tagged it as asterisk low confidence, speculative assessment, and buried it 2 layers down in the intelligence archive. She found it again the morning after Kepler's reach. She read it. Every word of it was correct. That was, in its way, the worst part. In the cargo bay of the asterisk Resolute Persistence asterisk, 6 weeks became 8, and the shell casing changed shape for the 43rd time. Yusuf understood engineering the way he understood chess, not as a system of rules but as a landscape of pressures. He'd grown up in Lagos, in a building where the elevator broke more often than it worked, and the generator was held together by 3 separate generations of improvised solutions, each one a response to the last failure, each one slightly more creative than the one before it. He had never thought of that as unusual. He had later learned that most of the galaxy thought of reliability as something you purchased, rather than something you built from whatever the situation gave you. The problem, Vasquez said, on what Yusuf had taken to calling a bad Tuesday, though the ship kept coordinated fleet time and technically there were no Tuesdays, is that below Class 7, we can't achieve the velocity needed for penetration against standard armor. Chemistry gives us a hard ceiling. Then we don't penetrate the armor. She looked at him. That's the entire point of. We go around it. He spread the schematics on the work table. What's the Dominion's sensor resolution on small mass projectiles, things below half a kilogram? Poor. Their systems are optimized for energy weapon tracking and high mass kinetics. Small chemical propellant rounds at those velocities would look like debris scatter. Yusuf nodded slowly. What if it wasn't a round? Define it. What if we're not trying to penetrate armor? What if we're designing something that doesn't need to, because it reaches the places where there isn't any? Vasquez stared at the schematics for a long time. You're describing a guided projectile, she said carefully. One small enough to fly under their tracking threshold, programmable enough to navigate to specific weak point coordinates, with a chemical propellant launch that doesn't trigger the accords. I'm describing, Yusuf said, 400 years of human weapons development that the Dominion has never had to worry about, Every iteration, every modification, every field repair from every conflict we ever fought where the standard equipment wasn't enough. That's a significant development timeline to compress. We've had 8 weeks and nothing else to think about. She picked up one of the prototypes, turned it over. It was smaller than her palm. It had 17 moving parts, a pressure differential seeker system, and a programmable detonation sequence that could be set to trigger on atmospheric composition change, meaning, specifically, on the pressurized atmosphere of a starship interior. Once it found a way through the hull gaps that every ship had if you knew where to look. "How many can we build?" she asked. "As many as we have materials for." A pause, both of them thinking about the cargo manifests from Kepler's reach. The Ferris Junction modifications. The 17 humans who'd spent 72 hours making 840 changes that nobody had investigated. "We already started building them," Yusuf said. 3 weeks ago. The crews at the evacuated stations started building them before we finished the design. I sent them the partial specs and told them to iterate." Vasquez set the prototype down carefully. "You sent incomplete weapon specifications to skeleton crews operating inside Dominion-controlled stations." "I sent incomplete weapon specifications to 47 teams of engineers with fabrication equipment, several months of materials, and the exact same problem we have. Humans are good at iterating on partial information." He paused. "Turns out some of them improved on the design." "How many versions are there now?" "Last count, 17. This is the detail Sorenveth found when she finally cracked the full intelligence archive 2 days after Kepler's reach. And it was the detail that caused her to sit very still for a very long time. The 840 modifications at Ferris Junction were not random. They were not structural deficiencies. They were mounting points. Every single one of them disguised as maintenance patches, gravity plate adjustments, ventilation brackets, was a prepositioned launch frame for projectiles small enough to pass beneath Dominion sensor resolution. When Darren Cass's forces had taken Ferris Junction, they had walked into a building that had been converted, without their knowledge, into a weapons platform. Not a weapons platform that could fire on its own. It needed a trigger signal, a specific, narrowband communication pulse that the Dominion systems would ignore as navigational noise. The station had been sitting there for 6 weeks, waiting. The Dominion had been doing maintenance in it, sleeping in it, running logistics operations in it, completely unaware that the third corridor's slightly funny gravity was the least of their problems. "This is impossible," Sorenveth said aloud to her empty office. Then she looked at the second file. There was a second station, and a third. Every position the Dominion had taken without resistance, the humans had surrendered deliberately. Every skeleton crew that had cooperated fully and immediately had spent their final days converting the facility. 6 weeks, 17 weapon variants, 47 teams iterating in parallel, 4 million units pre-staged in positions the Dominion now controlled. The humans hadn't been retreating. They had been reloading. Darren Cass had been confident at the morning briefing. He was almost always confident at morning briefings. It was a quality his staff valued, and in the quiet of her archive, Sorenveth had come to find mildly terrifying. He had announced the push to the Meridian Line. He had confirmed the fleet deployment. He had noted that human activity remained low across all monitored sectors, consistent with a consolidating defensive posture. The attack began 11 minutes into the advance. It didn't begin the way attacks began. There was no fleet movement, no weapon discharge signature, no warning from any of the 49 sensor arrays covering the advance corridor. It began with a sound, a specific narrowband communication pulse. And then every station the Dominion had taken, Kepler's Reach, Ferris Junction, the Delmore Relay, the Cassini Waypoint, 11 facilities across 4 systems, came alive simultaneously. What happened in the next 18 minutes had been reconstructed from the sensor logs, the wreckage, and the accounts of the 14% of Dominion forces who survived to provide them. Sorenveth had read every account, several times. The projectiles were small. Individually, they were almost insignificant. Each one massed less than 400 grams. Each one flew under every tracking threshold the Dominion used. Each one was programmed to seek hull gap coordinates, the seams, the ventilation passages, the places between armor plates that every ship had, that every species had simply accepted as acceptable tolerances, because nothing you launched in ship-to-ship combat was going to exploit a 5-centimeter gap from the inside of your own captured station. The Dominion ships did not have good responses to threats that were already inside the defensive perimeter. They had excellent responses to threats outside it. Beautiful, elegant, catastrophically irrelevant responses. The first wave hit 17 ships in the first 4 minutes. Not catastrophically, the projectiles were small, and initial damage was contained, compartment breaches, pressure losses, localized fires in 3 vessels. Survivable. The kind of damage that serious military ships are designed to absorb. The Dominion crews sealed compartments, activated redundant systems, did everything correctly. They did not know that the first wave was not the attack. The first wave was the navigation pass. Each projectile that entered a ship sent back a single pulse, atmospheric composition confirmed, internal geometry mapped before it detonated. 17 ships mapped from the inside in 4 minutes. The second wave used that data. They thought we were scared, Yusuf said. He was on the bridge of the Resolute Persistence watching the engagement feed with Vasquez and Commander Adiz Nwasu, who was running the trigger signal deployment. Nwasu was the calmest person Yusuf had ever met in a combat situation. She had a habit of narrating her own actions quietly as she performed them, a thing she'd said she'd started doing as a student to keep herself focused. Trigger pulse confirmed to all 6 primary stations, Nwasu said, very quietly, to no one in particular. Secondary pulse deploying in 40 seconds. 17 variants, Vasquez said, mostly to herself. She was watching the sensor returns from the mapped ships. I didn't think the Kepler teams would get the navigation seeker to work. They were 3 iterations behind. They weren't behind, Yusuf said. They were solving a different version of the problem. He watched the secondary wave hit. He watched 31 Dominion ships, the core of the assault fleet, go silent in 8 minutes. Not destroyed, disabled. The second wave projectiles had targeted propulsion and communications exclusively, using the interior maps the first wave had provided. 31 ships adrift, intact, alive mostly. He thought about that for a moment. Vasquez, he said. Yes. We need to start thinking about what they do next. They'll recalibrate their sensor systems to detect low-mass chemical propellant rounds. Yes. And then the 17 variants we currently have stop working. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. How long do we have before they adapt? Yusuf looked at the engagement feed. Longer than they'd like, less than we'd want. He pulled up the materials inventory. How many of the fabrication teams are still operational? All of them. We didn't use the station facilities in the attack. We kept them for production. He nodded. What are we on, variant 17? 17 and a half. Kepler's team sent a partial spec modification 2 days ago. Call it 18. He handed her the materials inventory. Start on 19. Sorenveth's formal report to the council ran to 640 pages. The executive summary was 11. The part the council actually read was 3 paragraphs. She had written it in 31 hours without sleeping. Not because she was trying to impress anyone, but because she had spent those 31 hours unable to stop following the data forward, and every thread she followed ended in the same place, and that place was not somewhere she had wanted to go. She requested an emergency audience with High Executor Marinsal. She received one 4 days later, faster than normal, which meant the council was more frightened than they were admitting. She stood in the chamber and felt the weight of 41 species representatives around the periphery, and she said what the data required her to say. The electromagnetic ordnance accords did not remove humanity's weapons platform, she said. The accords informed humanity that their current weapons platform was detectable, trackable, and politically constrainable. They used the 6 weeks of reduced activity to develop a replacement platform that is none of those things. The chamber was quiet. The engagement at Kepler's Reach involved approximately 4 million individually deployed projectiles, each below the Accord's restriction threshold, each below standard sensor detection limits, pre-staged across 11 facilities over a period of 6 weeks, modified through 17 parallel development tracks, and triggered simultaneously by a single communication pulse that our systems flagged as navigational noise. She paused. The facilities were ours. We occupied them. We did not know they were weapons platforms. How is that possible? Marinsal's voice carried the careful neutrality of someone who had already read the answer and was hoping the spoken version would be different. Because the humans who surrendered those facilities modified them before leaving, in every case, in ways that appeared to be routine maintenance. Another pause. We inventoried the modifications. We did not analyze them. Silence. How do we counter this? A Solemnary delegate asked. We recalibrate our sensor systems for low-mass chemical propellant detection. That neutralizes the current platform. Good, implement immediately. That neutralizes the current platform, Sorenveth repeated. The current platform is variant 17, or 18. I'm not certain which version was deployed at Kepler's Reach, because they appear to have been running multiple parallel development tracks simultaneously, and the evidence suggests they are already developing the next iteration. The chamber went very quiet in a different way. They are not designing a weapon, she said, because the data demanded it. They are designing a asterisk process asterisk. Every constraint we impose teaches them a new direction. The Accords did not slow them down. The Accords told them which limitations they needed to solve for, and they solved for them. And now they have a weapons architecture we have no doctrine to counter, built specifically from the shape of our own prohibition. She looked at Marinsal. He was very still. If we issue a second accord, she said, restricting chemical propellant systems below 400 grams, they'll develop something smaller, he finished. Or something that doesn't use propellant at all, or something that uses a mechanism we haven't cataloged. The Accords were designed to remove a specific capability. What we actually did was tell them exactly which capability to replace. She stopped. Let the silence hold. High Executor, I have read the engagement logs from 31 disabled vessels. I have read the accounts from surviving crew members. I want to describe what the crew of the asterisk contemplation of necessary outcomes experienced in the second minute of the engagement. She did. She did not editorialize. She did not add emphasis. She simply read what the crew had reported in sequence in their own words. The sound. The second sound. The realization, spreading through the crew like a current, that the ship was being mapped from the inside, that the threat was already past the hull, that there was no defensive response available because every defensive response they had was designed for the outside. They were not afraid, she said when she finished. I want to be precise about that. The human crew of the asterisk Resolute Persistence, the vessel that coordinated the attack, was 1,100 kilometers from the nearest engagement. They watched on sensors. I have access to their internal communication logs. She looked at her notes. At the moment the second wave triggered, Lieutenant Commander Adami said, and I am reading the translation directly, we need to start thinking about what they do next. The chamber did not respond for a long moment. He was talking about us, she said. He won the largest single engagement of this conflict, and the first thing he said was that we would adapt, and they needed to be ready for that. They were already moving to the next iteration before the battle was finished. She set down her notes. This is the element our threat assessments have consistently failed to model, not the engineering, not the creativity, the asterisk temporal relationship to victory. They do not pause at success. They treat success as a warning that the current approach has a limited lifespan. Marensal's secondary hand, she noticed, were clasped tightly together. What would you recommend? He asked. She had prepared for this. She had known it was coming. She had spent the last sleepless hour of her 31 hours deciding whether to say what the data recommended, and she had concluded that she had to, because the alternative was another 6 weeks of the Dominion making confident decisions based on the wrong model. Do not issue a second accord, she said. Negotiate an end to the conflict. The terms you accept today will be significantly better than the terms available after they build Variant 19. The negotiation took 11 days. Cassidy Okafor led the human delegation. She was, again, the youngest-looking person in the room. She sat across from Marensal and 4 senior Dominion representatives and an observer panel of 9 additional compact species, and she listened to the opening position with the same expression she'd worn when the original accords passed. On the 3rd day, Sarenveth was added to the Dominion team as technical advisor. It was not a role she had sought. She sat at the edge of the table and reviewed documents and answered questions, and did not look at Okafor more than was professionally necessary. On the 6th day, during a recess, Okafor walked past her and said, quietly and without stopping, "Your report to the council, the 600-page one." Sarenveth looked up. It was accurate, Okafor said. She kept walking. On the 9th day, Sarenveth asked the question that had been accumulating since the cargo bay manifests, the skeleton crew modifications, the parallel development tracks. The moment Yusuf Adami had said asterisk, we need to think about what they do next. She waited until the formal session had recessed, and Okafor was alone reviewing documents at the far end of the table. The accords, Sarenveth said. Okafor looked up. When they passed, you smiled. A pause, did I? I flagged it. I thought it was distress, masked acceptance. She sat down across from the diplomat. It wasn't. Okafor set down her documents. She had a very particular quality of attention, Sarenveth had noticed. When she focused on you, you had the sense that you had become the only thing in the room. No, Okafor said, it wasn't. You knew. I suspected. Yusuf confirmed it in about 3 hours. She paused. The accords told us what you were afraid of. That's the most useful intelligence you can give an opponent, not what they have, what they're afraid of. She tilted her head slightly. You were afraid of our railguns. You weren't afraid of anything that predated them because nothing that old could be a threat. Every civilization progresses. Old technology is primitive technology. That's a reasonable assumption. Another pause. It's wrong, but it's reasonable. Sarenveth was quiet for a moment. What happens when we adapt to Variant 18? Variant 19 is faster, Okafor said, and 20 is already theoretical. After that, she stopped, seemed to make a decision. The teams that worked on this have other projects, have had other projects the whole time. Things that don't intersect with the accords at all because we didn't think to hide them, we just hadn't needed them yet. The words settled into the room like something physical. The accords, Sarenveth said slowly. You could have ignored them, developed something else entirely. The restriction only applied to railguns. Yes. You let the restriction stand. You let us think we'd constrained you. The accords gave us time, Okafor said simply, and a direction, and 47 teams of engineers who had one very specific problem to solve and nothing else to do. She picked up her documents again. We didn't win this engagement because of Variant 17 or 18. We won it because you handed us a deadline, a constraint, and a population of problem solvers, and then left us alone for 6 weeks." She went back to reading. Sorenveth sat across from her for another moment. Outside the viewports of the treaty station, stars that had belonged to different species for 1,000 years sat impatient, in different arrangements. She thought about the shell casing, too small, laughably, impossibly small. She thought about the station commander with the enormous beard, who had shaken her colleague's secondary hand and warned him about the third corridor, and had been telling the complete truth, and had still been lying in every way that mattered. She thought about a lieutenant commander 1,100 kilometers from the largest battle of the conflict, saying, "We need to start thinking about what they do next before the last wave had even finished hitting." Your diplomat smiled, she said, not to Akafor now, but to herself, to her report, to the archive that would carry this data forward to whoever had to understand humans next. And I read it as masked distress. It was something else, something I did not have a classification for. She had one now. It wasn't relief. It wasn't triumph. It was recognition, the expression of someone who has been given the exact problem they already knew how to solve, and is grateful for the clarity. Humanity had not won because they were stronger. They were not stronger. They were not faster, not better equipped, not more numerous, not operating from any positional advantage the Dominion did not have in greater measure. They had won because when a door closed, they went quiet and went to work, and the work they did in the dark did not wait for permission or approval or favorable conditions. It simply continued. It iterated. It found the angles the restriction had forgotten to cover, and it built something new from the exact shape of the limitation. The way a river does not stop at a stone but becomes more powerful at the narrowing. The Accords had banned their railguns. The humans had said thank you and gotten to work. Variant 19 was already theoretical. Somewhere in a cargo bay that no longer had a Tuesday, a woman named Vasquez was holding a component smaller than her palm, turning it over in her hands, asking what if it didn't need to work that way at all asterisk. And an engineer who had grown up watching broken elevators get fixed with whatever the building had available was already nodding, already thinking 3 constraints ahead, already building the answer to the question nobody in the Dominion had thought to ask yet. The Galactic Compact would sign the settlement. They would call it pragmatic. They would call it de-escalation. They would write papers about it and conduct briefings about it, and some analyst in a future council would find Sorenveth's 600-page report and read it carefully and still, she suspected, missed the essential thing. The essential thing was not the weapons. The weapons were a symptom. The essential thing was what Yusuf Adami had said 1,100 kilometers from his own victory, in the first second after it was over, before the sensor returns had fully resolved, before anyone had confirmed the scope of what they'd done. We need to start thinking about what they do next. Not what we do next, what they do next. Humans, even winning, even in the moment of triumph, defaulted immediately to the future threat, to the adaptation they hadn't yet built for, to the version of the problem that didn't exist yet but would, because problems always did, because the galaxy did not grant rest to species that couldn't afford it. That was not strategy, that was not doctrine. That was something older and stranger, and considerably more dangerous. That was what the Dominion had tried to ban, and accidentally refined. Sorenveth closed her report. She flagged it at the highest available classification. She added a single recommendation at the end, in the space reserved for actionable intelligence summaries, and she wrote it not in diplomatic language or technical language, but in the plainest terms her training allowed. Do not constrain them again. Every constraint is a lesson. They learn faster than we impose limits. The species that survives contact with human ingenuity is the species that does not teach humans which directions are closed. She submitted it. She did not know if anyone would read it. She suspected, given how these things tended to go, that they would read the 3-paragraph executive summary and call it handled. She suspected the humans were counting on that.